Good afternoon. My name's Larry Forsyth. I'm the Senior Manager, WHS and HR Consulting Services with Australian Business Consulting and Solutions. We are a subsidiary of the New South Wales Business Chamber, and today I'm going to present to you a webinar for aged care providers based on improving recruitment and employee engagement, strategies for staff retention, and improving work health and safety capabilities. The program today has been funded by the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the Federal Department of Education, and Australian Business Consulting and Solutions have been engaged as part of that funding project to deliver for the aged care sector. So the three topics, as mentioned, I will be providing and sharing information with you today around best practices in these areas. When we think of staff turnover in this industry being aged care, and generically across many industries, we see the three top reasons that people leave their positions or their jobs can be lack of promotional opportunity, it can be poor relationship with their manager, and possibly even insufficient pay. Some of our research says that people don't always leave the organisation. Sometimes they'll leave the manager and the way that the manager actually manages them. So it's very important from a turnover, attraction, retention perspective that the manager really demonstrates a very sort of democratic leadership style, you might say, that they're emotionally intelligent and that they know how to coach and mentor their people. Through our research in the aged care industry, the issues that we've identified, and I suspect that you'll certainly align with, around co-worker and resident aggression. We're seeing that wages of registered nurses as residential aged care workers is actually 10% less than acute care nursing. And particularly in rural areas, it can be up to 12 to 13% less. What we're also seeing based on our research and my years of experience, probably around 6 or 7 collectively in the aged care industry, is that sometimes there is that role conflict. And due to a decrease in HR sometimes and training and admin support, what we're seeing now is that many registered nurses, for example, are dealing with excessive paperwork and not always able to put a high priority on the clinical issues. From a workforce planning perspective, some of the issues that we're seeing based on our research and the staff turnover, particularly in the aged care sector, it is sitting at around 25%. And this really indicates that it's a little bit higher than many other sectors, for example, manufacturing, operational, sort of mining areas as well. So there are higher training costs for services due to training new staff as a result of the high staff turnover rate. And some of the research says that it can be upwards of $20,000 to bring someone into a role, $20,000 to actually train them and bring them on board as part of their professional development. And then if they unfortunately leave the organisation, it can cost nearly that much again to bring on board a new person. So it becomes very expensive. So attracting and retaining your people is ultimately important. Other workforce planning issues that we've identified is that staff obviously need to be adequately trained in this area. Some of our research indicates that people that aren't employed and trying to get a job fall into the aged care sector, and they're not necessarily skilled or trained up in that particular way. So it's very important that they are skilled and they are trained in order to deliver high quality care to residents, particularly with the new funding model going through. So the delivery of high quality care to residents is a significant factor in employee retention, attraction and retention training of those people too. So when you're thinking about how you plan your workforce for the future and even now, obviously you need to think about what sort of training that you're going to put in place around that. Then thinking about recruitment strategies and competition for that, there's a lot of competitors out there, and we're all getting older and we will all need this sort of facility in the future. So improving that workplace retention generally involves better induction processes. Over my, I suppose, 20 years in the sector of consulting and HR and health and safety, organisational development, I have had organisations and staff come to me before and say that they've actually never even been through an induction process, and have told me things like that, that was the best induction process that they've been through. So it's very important to have that process in place, that strategy, right from the very beginning of bringing your employee on board. In that way, it supports and improves employee communication, and this should be a two-way street. I always suggest to employers that over-communication is better than not enough communication. And while you still get, or you may get, people that say that they didn't see the communication or it wasn't available to them, then it's good to actually have over-communication. And what I mean by that is on your systems, on your notice boards, in your policies and your procedures and your SharePoint. So as many places for communication as possible. Also, it supports, from a competitive recruitment strategy perspective, better selection processes. So communicating right from the very beginning of when you advertise for that particular role into the position descriptions, how you recruit, how you induct, how you train those people. And so what we're seeing here is a stronger employee life cycle from beginning right through to the end if that employee unfortunately leaves the organisation. So in the aged care sector, due to the many and complex issues I've highlighted here, and just a few of them, as well as those points, some of the additional strategies that are needed to assist with recruiting staff industry, I'll talk a little bit about those. Some of them are actually big picture, but it's based on our research from state and federal government perspective. Mentioning a job description, so from a recruitment perspective, it's very important to actually have one. In the resources that we will provide you as participants that have registered or viewed the webinar, we will provide you with a template around a job description, and in that way, if you wish, you can use that as a generic template. It's important to have a job description because it enables the participant, the worker, the staff member, the employee to actually understand, to know and be aware of what their job role is and what accountability they actually have for that position. I think it's also important, and we would always highly recommend that in the job description that there's a learning and development component. It might be an individual development plan, but it certainly enables the employee and their supervisor or manager, for example, as they go through the performance appraisal, and that they use the job description as a little bit of a platform to work from. Ideally, it would be good to have around 8 to 12 tasks on your position description or in your position description. Strategically, there may be more. Operationally, there may be more than those 8 to 12 tasks, but at least that many so that people are aware. When you get into tasks and responsibilities, you can't actually prescribe it right down to the nth degree, but at least it gives people an overview of what it is, and then it's about what that process is on the ground and working with that particular staff member to enable them to know and to do what actually is required on the job. If you don't have a job description, well then it's very difficult for a person to properly commit to or be accountable for the role. And so if, for example, your worker was to make a complaint around how they've been treated, how they weren't retained, attracted, reviewed, looked after and cared about in the organisation, then it might be a claim. It wouldn't stand up just on its own, but it might be a claim that they actually didn't have a position description or a job description, and in that way, how can they be accountable? So there's no written notice about that. And without a job description, it's actually hard to manage an employee or worker's performance because, as I said, it's very, very important for them to know what to do, when to do it, and to be accountable for it. And if they don't have one, well then how can you actually performance review or appraise what they're doing? From an interviewing and selection perspective, the stages of recruitment include certainly sourcing the candidates by advertising and or other methods. So it could be through your referrals, through your networks, through social media. We're seeing a lot more of that, particularly in the last couple of years. I think the aged care sector is certainly onto this as well. From that point, you can screen your potentials using tests or interviews. I wouldn't recommend that a test be a standalone procedure that you recruit someone on. It has to be a range of strategies that you would employ. So from there, you would have behavioural questioning, scenario building, panel interviews, and then you could also have a short test, for example, and it may be a literacy and numeracy test, or it might be a personality instrument, or so on. So from an onboarding perspective, it's important to ensure that your candidate is able to fulfill their new role effectively, and by undertaking these strategies and how you recruit certainly would be best practice. I mentioned before around social networks, and we're seeing more and more of that across many, many sectors. Gamification has become very, very popular, and so in that way it greatly enables the aged care facility to improve their reach right across nationally and even globally. In that way, it can be initially a little bit informal, but it enables the organisation to identify people that could match what the organisation is about, in line with their mission, their values, their philosophy. From that point in the social networking space, you can certainly view that person's skill set when you think of LinkedIn as an example. People that have actually really churned up their LinkedIn page, they're going to have a lot of their skill set. They're going to certainly have possibly endorsements, those sorts of things, which shouldn't be just a standalone recruitment piece, but certainly things that you can view initially. And then from that point, you can contact them easily ahead of the competition, perhaps, and start to sort of headhunt in that way. But social networks is certainly the way to go. Some of the options, I mentioned LinkedIn before, but you can see there some of the top social networking recruiting stats coming through from 2013. We're collecting them from 2014 at present, but certainly LinkedIn, Facebook, Twittering, etc. So people are really into it at present. So if you're looking at recruiting, retaining, bringing on people, then think about social networking as well as part of that recruitment process. So when you're screening potential candidates, I mentioned before about the interviews, the verbal and non-verbal interactions are obviously very important. You want to focus on gathering the information to decide on that course of action. So you want to make sure that the skills, the knowledge, the capabilities, obviously the experience of the person, and sometimes it's actually really hard to find the right person for the right job at the right time. But I think again, it's about persistence, and if you can be in a position that you wait for the right person to come along, that might be a good position. But then again, the job has to be done. So again, you go through the process, then if the person leaves quickly. But in the end, you can only really do the best that you can do. So if you have a best practice strategy in place, how you recruit, how you screen, how you interview people, and you follow that as part of your policies and procedures, and you really stick to that, and you train your managers and supervisors, your operational people, in how to actually undertake that and implement, well then that's all that you can do to the best of your ability. Some of those types of interviews, well obviously the phone call, the initial screening. I know myself, I've done many screenings through Skype and phone calls initially, and then you move into the face-to-face interview when you're shortlisting, the video conferencing, the Skype example, and then into the group interviews. I worked with a national organisation in private health, and they would do group interviews and bring in their people or bring in candidates, and in those interviews they would look for leadership capabilities, problem-solving capabilities, and those types of things, and in that way they could shortlist and invite people back. It's actually a very, very sort of empowering way of bringing people on board and being able to identify. And it doesn't mean to say that the person that didn't demonstrate the most leadership or the highest level of leadership on that particular day was the only person that got through to the next level. It really gives you an ability to be able to identify, to sort of think about that, reflect on what people are saying and how they're saying it, to try to align how they demonstrate that with the organisational culture, the mission, the philosophy as well. Some of those interviewing techniques, well, open questions are certainly good. You just don't want people saying yes, no, yes, no. And so you want to have some behavioural questions, situational questions in preparation for that as well. So I would suggest that you give them some case study as part of that sort of audition. You want to simulate a possible business scenario for them to give a response to that based on their past experience. And in that way, it provides an opportunity to give a real-life example. People will use in interview processes certainly hypothetical, and that's okay too. You might have a couple of real-life ones and a hypothetical situation. But what I found certainly is that if the organisation is asking you a hypothetical and they frame it up in that way, then it's quite possible that that could be a real situation in the organisation. So preparation in that way is important too. And so from an interviewing technique perspective, you want to give the right answers, and it doesn't mean to say that that person will be the chosen person based on the action, but it gives you an indication of how that person is responding, part of their actions, tone of voice, body language, looking out for all of those interpersonal capabilities as well. From an onboarding perspective, you want to introduce the new starter to the team, and so this is really sort of from day one and rolling it out over the first week, the first couple of weeks as well. You want to ease them into the culture. You wouldn't expect that the person's going to necessarily hit the ground running, even though that there will be some workers like that, and they're probably the best ones to get, but not everyone is in that same sort of way. So it's about that you want to introduce them around, ease them into it. I always have a bit of a thing that you can't change things quickly, and it's the small steps that really count. In that way, introducing them into the organisation, taking them through the induction, certainly speaking to them and letting them know about the policies and procedures around uniforms, smoking areas, non-smoking areas, and then certainly information about policies and procedures. So as an organisation, we use our fantastic product HR Advanced to develop policies and procedures for business, and business can also purchase that from us. So they're legally compliant documents that are approved by our lawyers. So it's a great system and product to have. From a Fair Work Ombudsman perspective and thinking about performance management in the workplace, well, our research tells us that the Fair Work Ombudsman believes that employees who establish effective performance management systems can certainly reap significant benefits from a happy, motivated and better performing workforce versus an organisation that doesn't have a performance management system in place. Certainly my time and experience over the years is that you mention the word performance management to people, and some of them can feel a little bit threatened by that. There's certainly some talk in the HR space and performance review space around not having these necessarily on an annual basis. And as a supervisor manager, you're probably on a daily, weekly basis working alongside or observing, checking in with your people around how they're performing anyway. So you're getting a general idea of how they work, and perhaps the performance appraisal is just an annual sort of structured format that is a best practice strategy. Doesn't mean to say that you should get rid of it, but there's a couple of different ways of looking at it, as I said, as part of a dialogue in the HR space at present. But in saying all of that, it's important to have some sort of performance review, check-in system in place with your people, because that does motivate people. They want to know how they're going. They do want to get the feedback, and thinking about, why don't people give feedback? Well, sometimes they feel threatened by that. They don't know how to do it, and I'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. So what is performance management? Well, there certainly is effective performance, and it creates a harmonious and productive workplace, which is definitely beneficial to the organisation and your workers. And in that way, as I said, people feel more empowered around what they're doing, getting the feedback, and being recognised and rewarded in that way. So in what I'm talking about there is your reward and recognition program, your health and wellbeing programs. And if you don't have those in place, you can certainly talk to me about that. We support organisations around implementing those programs and strategies to support best practice employer of choice as well. So good performance obviously is work that performs the duties of the position, or the worker performs the duties of the position and performs them to the standard required based on the standards within the organisation, the code of conduct, the practices, the policies, the processes. It's also compliance with the internal workplace policies, rules or procedures. It's about acceptable behaviour in the workplace, and in that way that people are comfortable about that, they get along with each other, that they collaborate and they consult and they communicate. Some of my experience is that it's sometimes a different workplace, or it could be the same workplace, what I should say is, but what we're seeing, and people tell us that communication is always something that needs to be improved. So that sort of positive communication and behaviour certainly impacts on your workers and your co-workers in a very, very positive way compared to or versus negative behaviour. People that have got problems always going to their manager without solutions and those sorts of things. So you really want your people to be able to manage upwards, and you want to coach them around coming to you with solutions and just not problems as well. So in that way, good performance certainly is about the worker getting the job done to the satisfaction of the employer. Some reasons for underperformance, which I suppose really is the opposite of good performance. So no feedback on the employee's performance from the manager, and in that way the manager could be perceived to be actually not managing that person to the best of their capability. We certainly work with organisations and managers around those sorts of things, and we coach managers and supervisors and executives around how they give feedback and how ultimately important and significant it is to sustain productivity and better workplace outcomes. Another reason around underperformance could be that there's a mismatch between the employee's capabilities and the job expectations. And so that's why it's really important from that early stage in the recruitment process to really look at that person's capability, their experience, to align it with the position description, the induction, and so you're starting to see that there's a true linkage through the employee life cycle. It can also be that the employee lacks the skills and knowledge for the job, and so we have seen from time to time coming into the aged care sector where organisations, really just need some people on the ground to sort of help out. It's not necessarily always the best way to go because these people won't have the skills and knowledge, and they may take longer to train. And then if you train them, and then they move on because they want more money or they think they're getting a better deal somewhere else. So it's very important, that you do this from the beginning, how you attract and retain your people. It can also create low workplace morale if you're not managing your people. Of course, what happens is that we're all human, and the world has become more complex and sophisticated. But people also, have situations where they have family stress. They may have drug or alcohol issues. And so how are you managing that from a performance perspective as well? So thinking about your policies and procedures and what you have in place around that. And then there can be cultural misunderstandings. And I had an experience just once where there was some cultural misunderstanding in an aged care organisation where I worked based on people coming from Papua New Guinea and the supervisor and how they used to treat each other. And there was an investigation around that, and what we identified was that it was a cultural issue, and neither party actually understood how the other party was, I suppose, working from a cultural perspective. And so we went into some cultural awareness training. We delivered that. We actually had to undertake some mediation around that as well. But in the end result, it was very successful because people agreed to sort of work better together, understood where they were coming from a cultural perspective because we had run the cultural awareness training. And so we had a very successful and good outcome with that. And then particularly we're seeing very prevalent now with the new act coming on board last year around workplace bullying. So there's certainly a difference between what is bullying and what isn't. And so performance management is not bullying in the workplace. But bullying is really classified as any repeated unreasonable behaviour. So there certainly is a very strong line between those two. So what is best practice performance management? It's certainly about planning what you're going to do with that. So training your supervisors and your managers in actually undertaking performance appraisals, but also training the people on the ground in what their responsibility is and what they're supposed to be doing around that as well. So they have provision for that too, because it's not just about a one-way street there. So it's the supervisor manager training and the people on the ground training around performance appraisals, what to expect, their tasks and responsibilities around that too. And from there, if you actually put that in place from a best practice perspective, you will get better development, learning and development, and you can plan people's development too. You can budget for those sorts of things as well. It creates a problem-solving culture and a solution-oriented culture. And in that way, it also supports people and their career planning, whether it be a career within your organisation or perhaps even moving on to develop their career. But I think it's always best practice management to support people around their career, whichever way that they're going. Further to that best practice model, I think it certainly ensures that you have the facts and you don't want to be subjective around what the facts are. You want to be objective and you want to think about them based on the evidence and those informed decisions. You want to be able to give feedback around the examples of poor performance. And some of my experience is that managers don't necessarily take very good records around that. So when you go back to your employee and you want to give them some feedback around that they weren't performing to the standard, then you need to have when that was, for how long that was, so which particular day, which particular time, which particular week. So very strong records around performance is ultimately important because we can't always remember everything at every time. So I always really highly recommend good records around performance appraisals, reviews, management, etc. And be precise and selective in what you say and how you say it. Giving feedback can be a very emotional thing for the giver and the receiver. And so what happens there is your emotional intelligence comes into play and you need to be very careful. You don't want to use a harsh tone of voice. You don't want to use negative body language around that as well. And that takes practice. And so, as I said, it's an emotional situation at times. And so best practices around how you say it, when you say it, and where you say it. So I would always recommend that initially it's in a closed room situation. If you feel that you would like to have a witness there, and provide that person with the possibility that they might have someone with them as well from an emotional perspective, not necessarily to speak for them, but they can have that person as that support if they require or need that. Further, I think it's important that when you're speaking with the employee, as I said, you use calm and a calm tone of voice, body language, and have an open discussion around that. You want to keep the questions open-ended. You want to reinforce positive things that the employee has done well, and you want to acknowledge their strengths. I think with the world going so quickly, as I said before, sophisticated, complex, we're all wearing 3 and 4 hats to get the job done. We're working with leaner strategies. And sometimes we actually forget to acknowledge and recognize our workers. So I think a culture around that is also very important from a best practice perspective. You want to ensure that the employee is aware of the specific tasks of their job, and that's where the position description or job description really comes into play. So if you don't have one, well then, as I said, we are going to provide you with a template there, so you could use that generically, and you could certainly use that to put down particular tasks for that particular employee, the job role, etc. And you want to show the employee how to do the job, so it's about how they perform in that role. You can't just always expect them to hit the ground running. So if you've trained them in what to do, you've provided that training, that coaching, the time to do it, you've given them the feedback, you've appraised them, you've recognized them, well then you're doing it to the best of your ability. And in that way, they can't turn around and say that they haven't been provided with that time. And in that way, it enables you to understand what the gaps may be with that person's performance, giving them that feedback, giving them more time to do it, and sometimes giving them the benefit of the doubt. And I think it needs to be done in a very reasonable way as well. Thinking about feedback and how important it is in the workplace. So feedback really is about creating empathy, and that's part of your emotional intelligence and your social awareness and competence in that as well. So thinking about, are you an empathic person? Are you able to demonstrate that? And what are some of the demonstration or behaviors around being able to provide empathy and to relate to that? When you're giving feedback, yes, it is about being brief. Some people will want it in more detail, so be prepared for that as well. You want to be patient. You want to be emotionally intelligent and sensitive around how people might feel. They might feel threatened. They might actually get their back up about the feedback. But it's important that you as a supervisor or manager practices that, and in that way you will get better at giving the feedback. You want to give the feedback based on the past behaviour. It's not necessarily about that person and who they are and their personality. It has to be based on the performance. So be specific, I should say, excuse me, and avoid general comments. You don't want it to be ambiguous. You want it to be hitting the nail on the head. So that's why it's very important to actually keep good records. And don't assume. You don't want to make assumptions. Yes, you can have your assumptions challenged, but you want to get the correct information, and you may need to speak to a few people around that if you're looking for particular evidence. But you should let the employee know that you are collecting that evidence. You don't want to sweep it under the carpet, hide it away, because that's about transparent communication. And so all parties need to be involved and aware of what's going on. Obviously, there will be discretion and confidentiality as part of that feedback process, but it's certainly not to be done in a negative way. So when meeting with your employee, let the employee explain what the situation was or had transpired. You want to be able to resolve disagreements. It won't necessarily always be a win-win, but based on your code of conduct, based on the organizational philosophy, the mission and the values, the strategic intent and the operational requirements, well then maybe the employee doesn't really like the way it's going. Well, then it's their choice to leave the organization. But if you stick to your standards, your codes, your regulations, that is best practice. In planning and developing and around learning and development, you want to do it together. You want to collaborate around that. You want to agree on what the goals are. Clarify any details. So ask the employee if they have any questions about what needs to be done. Again, remaining calm and relaxed and encouraging. So that's a good job, and thank you very much. You know, I'd like that to be done by 3 o'clock this afternoon. Are you okay about that? Would you consider that's reasonable? Or it might be in the next few days, weeks. You don't want to be in a position where you're micromanaging everyone, and you want your employees to be able to manage upwards as well. Thinking about giving feedback and performance appraisals, it's also important if you need one to get an interpreter. You don't always want to use the jargon. Not everyone remembers the acronyms of all of the jargon. We have a lot of jargon and acronyms in organizations today. You might have to spell it out for people. You want to talk about the issue, as I said before. It's not about the person and how they look or how they sound. It's about what the performance actually is. And then you want to summarize the meeting and check to the understanding. So gain agreement. It may even be important to actually gain agreement and written agreement around that. You actually can't always make someone sign something, but it's good to take notes and record, as I've certainly been emphasizing. And don't discuss personalities. It's not about the person's personality, it's about their performance. Don't skirt around criticism either. So if the employee's got something to say about you which you consider is critical, well then you're certainly able to communicate back around that. But you know, you too, as a supervisor manager, have to take on board the feedback. And so in that way, it's not about getting defensive around that. It might be a simple thank you for the feedback, and enables you to reflect on that and then perhaps gather information and go back and have further consultation or communication with that employee. I wouldn't recommend that you compare necessarily to others. Yes, workers might be doing the same job, but it can get people's backs up. Joe, you're doing a better job than Jim, and so that's not really the language that I would recommend. You don't want to nitpick as such. That can be really sort of unauthentic and not very ethical. And you don't want to bring up unrelated issues that have been resolved previously. A lot of people, you know, do that from time to time. Well, you know, when you did that before, sort of thing, is the language. If it's been agreed and people have moved on and they've addressed these issues and turned them around, then there's no point in bringing it up again, because that could get back up again. From a termination of employment perspective, well, you wouldn't want to have a situation where it was considered in a court of law that it was harsh, unjust, or unreasonable, and how that employee was treated. So fair treatment is very, very important. We see that small businesses don't always have that HR management or IR officer in place. Many of the reasons they come to us, and we business partner with them and our lawyers around that. And so from an employee perspective or termination, the employee must have worked for the business for 12 months to make an unfair dismissal claim. So you don't want your people to be terminated necessarily, and you don't want your people to make a claim either. And so what you need to consider is that the way that you treat your people, and you wouldn't want to be treating them in that harsh, unjust, or unreasonable way. What's also important around looking after your people, caring for them, nurturing them, is around learning and development. So your technical training is obviously important to make sure that they're doing the job, but think about leadership training, supervisor training, communication courses, manual handling, customer service, mentoring, coaching. Those sorts of things are also very, very important as the sort of soft skills of the workplace. More and more we're seeing that people are promoted based on their emotional intelligence and not just their IQ. Because these people can actually be more effective in the workplace based on their emotions, being aware, more regulated around their emotions, being able to demonstrate empathy, their social competence. And so think about learning and development as important elements within the workplace too. Many times in economic times, when times are tough, these learning and development and HR type strategies actually fall down, budgets are reduced for them. But what we saw through the GFC, for example, was that those employers and organisations that continued to develop their people, train their people, were the ones ready when they came out of the GFC, compared to the organisations that let it drop off. Yes, you had to combat the budgets, but we certainly saw that people, as I said, that worked on it and still delivered learning and development and cared for their people and spent money on them to professionally develop them during that time. As I said, we're ahead of the game. Some suggestions to improve learning and development. Well, you certainly want to create a positive work environment, and in that way, if you survey your people, find out what they need, what they want. You can't always do everything that they're asking based on your budgets, based on the time and the efforts, but it's certainly about having at least some sort of plan in place around that. You want to seek that communication contribution from your staff that's empowering and very, very important as a best practice strategy. And you want to promote flexible rostering for study time. So my experience from a HR perspective working in the aged care sector was that we just didn't deliver training 9 to 5 Monday to Friday. We certainly took into consideration people that were, or workers that were working overnight on weekends, and we had to be flexible about that as well. And when we delivered, because everyone needed to participate, everyone needed to at least have some availability in that. So think outside the square with how you flexibly deliver learning and development. And of course, you want to promote learning and development courses. We're seeing a lot more courses now online, but let me tell you, organisations still are really enjoying a lot of face-to-face training as well. So this is very important from an accredited and non-accredited perspective. Some of the WHS responsibilities, and moving into that space now, we've come from engagement and retention through performance management, but now into work health and safety responsibilities. So under the Act 2011, there certainly are responsibilities for the organisation, but ultimately the person conducting a business or undertaking. So we use a acronym for that, the PCBU, and I'll use that as we move through the slides, and most of you would have heard of that term and understand. Also, there's a role there for officers. So the business would be the PCBU. Officers would be the directors, the board members, the chairman, and then you've got workers, be it the employees, contractors, volunteers, subcontractors, and so on. So even your trainees, your apprentices, those sorts of people, and I think I mentioned volunteers are certainly classified as workers under the Act as well. Some of the duties of the officer, so it's any person who can make or participate in making decisions that affect the whole or a substantial part of the business of the corporation. So in that way, I'd be saying to you, have your officers actually been identified? Who are they, and are they the people that monitor, review, and make the decisions? And they need to be aware of their role. Some of the workers' responsibilities, as I mentioned, employees, contractors, volunteers, subcontractors, and they must take reasonable care of their own health and safety. I mean, ultimately, you want people to work safe, home safe, and in that way, if you have strong policies and procedures and your people understand what they need to do and they follow due diligence and reasonable practicability in that way, and they're looking after themselves and others where they can, then you know that there's a culture of best practice health and safety. So in that way, you don't want people to behave or conduct themselves that puts themselves into a risky situation or adversely affects others. So your workers must follow instruction so far as reasonably able to do so, and they must cooperate with reasonable notified policies and procedures. Now we all know that not everyone reads everything, but it's about that they need to be made aware that they're there. Some policies and procedures actually need to be signed off. Different organisations will do different things, but you want to follow certainly the standards, the Australian standards, and you want to have your own standards and codes in place as well. So your code of conduct certainly comes into play here. As I mentioned, the PCBU. So the PCBU's role is that they must ensure, so far as reasonably practicable, that the health and safety of work is engaged or caused to be engaged by the person. And workers whose activities are carrying out or being carried out at work are influenced or directed by the person. So while the persons are at work in the business or the undertaking, the PCBU ultimately is the most responsible. In the past, before the Act changed, it was really pushed down to the people on the ground. And while they have and I'm talking about the operational people, and they certainly have a very valuable role, and we certainly need them. But they were really sort of taking on that responsibility ultimately, and it just wasn't working very well. So that's where the law changed, and the PCBU really became the ultimate responsible sort of entity for the people on the ground too, and they were the ones that were making the decisions. The officers were certainly doing that as well. So the PCBU, other persons are not put at risk, as I said, in that way by the PCBU undertaking that sort of final decision and that monitoring, etc. And it can be carried out as part of the conduct of the business or undertaking. And your workers need to be made aware of that. So we would always be recommending training for harmonisation training for the PCBU, certainly the officers, and then management supervisor training, and certainly work health safety awareness training for your people on the ground. So there's a few tiers there or levels. In that way, from a strategic perspective, the PCBU, the officers, certainly knowing what the responsibilities are there, and that health and safety awareness, certainly people on the ground. If you don't have good health and safety, then it can affect the impact on the ground, and can certainly impact the quality of the resident care. And this can have a negative impact on the staff engagement. It can lower morale or productivity. It can create a poor culture, which in turn then we see higher absenteeism, staff turnover, and the list goes on, and you can see that there. And then we're moving back into a position where we have to recruit again, so it's costing us more money, more time. Obviously, it's the law that you have compliance. Now, health and safety actually never goes away. It's an ongoing journey. It's never ending, and people must adhere to it. And as I said before, people want to work safe and go home safe, and be able to do it in all areas. So it's very important that you have really strong and robust policies and procedures, particularly around your contractors, how you work with your workers, because if you don't, then these things can actually happen. Policy implementation and training, again, best practice and a requirement. So we develop our policies and procedures from our fantastic HR Advanced product. And then we also support, from a consulting perspective, organisations and how they implement. We train people in manual handling, bullying, customer service, risk management, health and safety awareness. So it's not just having a list of policy or policy hard copy in a folder sitting on the shelf. It's about what you actually do with that, and that people understand how to use it. So in that way, a framework for implementing a safety starts with the appropriate policies and procedures. And it supports effective workplace consultation and risk management strategies. And these are essential aspects of implementing your organisation's health and safety management systems and program. And these really are the fundamentals. So if you've got good policies and procedures, they're robust, they're rigorous, they're reviewed, and that people are aware that they're there, that you use that as part of your platform in support of your compliance journey. The implementation is always the hardest. It doesn't matter what we're talking about. We can develop and write and think about it and talk about it, but implementation is ultimately the key. So it's a process of putting the decisions that you've made, particularly the policies, an example, into effect. And procedures and training are part of the implementation process. Again, the training, it's certainly required by law in aged care. We've been working with the National Aged Care Organisation for the last couple of years, and we deliver manual handling training for those workers in aged care right around Australia. Annually, this has been taking place, and the organisation has certainly seen the number of manual handling claims and incidences reduced. They don't always go away, but they've certainly seen them reduced based on the delivery of that manual handling. And in that way, you can pull your program together. It demonstrates the desired behaviour, because you've got to instruct, inform, coach and guide your people around the training as well. Sometimes people don't know what they don't know. They don't know what sort of training that they need. They don't know what training is necessarily to be compliant. But I would always be recommending manual handling, risk management, health and safety awareness training right across the board, up and down the different levels. Consultation, obviously very, very important, and we see that is particularly significant in the health and safety laws now, in that if you don't consult with your workers, because they're the ones that know what it's like on the ground in the operations, then that can be considered that you haven't really communicated with them. It can be evidence that you can't gather and you can't produce. So the law requires you as an organisation to set up a mechanism for that consultation. We develop consultation process flowcharts and methodologies for organisations in that way. We support organisations and how they embed that, implement that as well. So how do we do that? Well, we can use representatives. The organisation can certainly use health and safety reps. It's important to have safety committees as well. You don't have to have those committees trained from an accredited perspective. We do run short courses ourselves around safety committees and how to actually run a committee, what the agenda items should be, how to action those things, who to follow up with, and to make it sort of accountable as well. Other agreed arrangements might be things like toolbox talks, staff meetings, and notice boards, just making sure that the message is out there continually. You want to really get people to identify hazards, and so in that way you can record those, and in that way it certainly makes the incidents decrease. So increasing your hazard identification certainly decreases incidents and injuries. And I've certainly emphasised risk management, and so from some of these examples here, it's important to identify those hazards so that they can actually support the reduction of incidents and injuries from happening. And whatever you do, it's always very, very important to record, to report on these items of risk management so that people know actually how to undertake a risk assessment. They're just not thinking about it, that it's recorded and reported as some of that lead and lag indicator. So we're seeing certainly hazardous manual tasks that you would relate to within the aged care sector. Psychological issues are predominant as well, and then we're still seeing in the news, the media, the research around aggression based on dementia, unfamiliar surroundings, and so on. And so these are issues certainly for the aged care sector. The Work Health Safety Act 2011 defines health as both physical and psychological. So I've been talking very much about the physical, but the psychological element is also relevant. And so, you know, it ensures that the duty, so as far as reasonably practicable, to health and safety extends to ensuring the emotional and mental health of workers. And some of the stats that we're seeing predominantly over the last 12 months, 1 in 5 workers in Australian organisations will have mental health issues, and some of those symptoms around anxiety and depression could be the worker themselves, not just necessarily the resident. So it's very important to think around those psychological hazards as well. Some of the causes, the 3 broad categories, it could be position related. The work environment, the number of hats they're working, the demand, the time frames, the high output, working alone. It could possibly be role ambiguity. That might be based on the fact that they're not sure what they needed to do because they didn't have a position description in the first place. And it can also be around insufficient feedback or not getting any feedback at all. So people feel isolated, they feel fatigued. Excuse me, they're working longer hours, doing more work, and you know, it can be certainly sort of very threatening for people. But we want to be able to look after our people and identify these things. We've been running some mental health workshops for organisations nationally, and supporting them around how what might be the model that they could use to actually be able to identify a mental health issue in the workplace. And if you're interested in those, please get in touch with me. So preventing psychological claims, be aware of the burnout, and this enables the reduction of fatigue and stress. If you're, you know, certainly the awareness is there. You want to establish strong policies and procedures around emergency situations and effective communication and systems. You want to be able to deal with the effects of aggression, and that can certainly prevent psychological claims. Team training, provide access, debriefing, counselling, employee assistance programs. Certainly monitor and review your incidents, because if you've got a lot of high aggressive incidents taking place in your organisation, then you need to be able to manage that, investigate it, and turn that around and address that, and you might need some external support with that. And of course, you want to be able to get sufficient sleep, exercise and nutrition, a work-life balance. It never goes away. The wording's been there for a long time, but how are you doing that? What sort of strategies have you got in place for your workers? Certainly something to think about in relation to psychological claims. So in saying all of that, how do you know that staff are actually getting the health and safety message, and what are your measures of success? Are the most urgent hazards addressed? Or is there an increase in the number of hazards reported? Are employees involved in all the workplace inspections? Are they increasing the solutions to the hazards and risk managing those based on their risk management awareness and management of that risk? You want to mitigate these issues. And is there an increased level of interest and involvement of staff? If there isn't these things in place, then you're possibly not getting the message right across the board. So again, it's that full-on communication. You want to be able to monitor and audit your changes and systematically as well. This supports your continuous improvement, your funding, your accreditation. And when your auditors come along from a health and safety perspective, they'll certainly be wanting to have a look at the lean indicators and the lag indicators, and when you do your inspections, particularly around falls, those sorts of things. So make sure that you really report on these two, that you have a metric around these lead and lag indicators is obviously best practice from a systematic perspective as well. So in this way, it does really improve work health and safety productivity if you can put in place the things that I've talked about there from a health and safety perspective. You can measure your health and safety performance, and in this way you can certainly address your risks and productivity gains, and they will certainly be made more sustainable, particularly from that health and safety perspective. So if you want to improve your engagement, your retention, how you look after your staff, how you train them, how you performance appraise them, how you give them feedback, how you train them, and how you look after them and they look after themselves from a workplace health and safety productivity perspective, then I hope the slides that I've shared with you today and provided for you, certainly, you've learned at least one new thing. I'm hoping at least 5, and you can take that away with you today. As I said, participants that have registered today and have viewed, we'll certainly be supplying you with some best practice documentation and templates and processes. So look out for those in the next sort of few days coming through. Again, I'd like to thank you very much for viewing in today. I appreciate your time. I know that time is limited, but then again, I wish you well in your workplaces. Signing out, Larry Forsyth from Australian Business Consulting and Solutions. Thank you and good afternoon.